we're talking with Tony Wicks of Actimize, and we're going to be talking about the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, which is coming out of the U.S. So why should European banks be concerned with this new act?
Okay, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act is an interesting piece of legislation. It came into law in March 2010 in the US and actually will become effective in 2013 on the 1st of January. It's interesting because it's actually transnational in its scope, which means that all European institutions need to assess their Fatca position, and they need to make plans in terms of how they will move forward with Fatca. In relation to the legislation itself, these institutions are considered to be foreign financial institutions because of the US focus, but certainly they have an obligation and a potential liability under Fatca.
So what is the purpose of Fatca?
So Fatca is all about cracking down on US tax evasion. And fundamentally its purpose is to increase the receipts or tax receipts into the US IRS. And it does this by through the purposes of identifying offshore US accounts. And it does that really in two ways, and it cuts in sort of two directions if we distill Fatca to this sort of simplest possible basis. Firstly, it introduces an additional obligation for US taxpayers, people that are already reporting to the IRS, to actually declare their offshore bank accounts. But more importantly, it also places a new obligation on foreign financial institutions, so that's our European banking customers, to actually provide additional reports to the IRS about tax affairs or accounts that could potentially be liable for US tax. And in fact, those that may also have other US tax-related treatments that need to be applied to those accounts. Because it's US legislation, banks could decide not to participate in Fatca, and in fact some of them may choose to do that. But the sting in the tail of Fatca is that if a bank chooses not to be compliant, and actually because it's US legislation and US law, there's nothing that's forcing them to be compliant. If they choose not to be compliant, then they will be actually subject to what is a 30% tax withholding on all US-related income streams. So any US-sourced funds that are being paid into their accounts and to their customers that are associated with US income that might be related to dividends, investments, salaries, or other types of investment streams that are coming from the US. And that's a big kicker. That's going to have a large amount of customer impact, and that's going to be a big reason why institutions need to become Fatca compliant.
How can banks comply with Fatca?
Right, so the legislation is, as I said, is very complex, but there has been guidance provided by the IRS. The latest set of guidance came out in July of this year, and they set down some various requirements that banks will need to do. So firstly, they need to decide whether they're actually going to become a participating financial or foreign financial institution within the scope of the Act. And by July 2013, they need to actually register with the IRS to actually make that clear that that's their intent. They need to change their onboarding systems for new customers so that they can better identify clients or new customers that potentially have a US tax liability. And then there is additional phases that they will have to do a full account review for their private banking clients, so private banking or wealth related clients that will need to be completed by the end of 2014. And then by July 2015, they will need to have done a full review of all of their customer accounts, and in fact anybody that has or holds a balance over the equivalent of $50,000.
I know it's early days, but have you been seeing any best practice for Fatca compliance coming out of European banks?
So I think there's really three fundamental things that banks should be thinking about and that they should be doing now. And in fact, we've been seeing this from a number of our customers that are already have Fatca in their sites and are actually working towards it. So those three things are, first and foremost, is to realise that actually Fatca is here now, and that banks need to do something about it immediately. So they need to appoint their compliance officer or a responsible officer within the bank that will be responsible for this Fatca reporting process, and they need to start to think about reviewing their client systems and actually making sure that the actually have a project plan in place in order to be able to execute on Fatca. Fatca is actually rushing towards us a lot quicker than people actually realise. This July 2013 deadline is actually when those systems and processes will need to be in place associated with the whole Fatca piece. So that's really the first area that they need to concentrate on. The second area is that they need to be thinking about actually a review of their existing client and onboarding systems, and as part of that review, or a health check as we would call it, as part of that review they need to be thinking about what the implications will be in terms of the operational workload that will be created through Fatca reviews. So we are suggesting, we're talking to clients and making the suggestion that they should be actually getting some idea of the prediction of the workload levels that will be required in order for them to do these account reviews associated with Fatca, so that they can best manage that process over the Fatca life period. And then the third and final element, I think, that, and this probably is the most important in order for them to consider, is the fact that actually Fatca is very, very tied to anti-money laundering processes, and in particularly the process of customer due diligence associated with banks. Customer due diligence has come into the regulatory spotlight recently for a number of reasons, partly because of the FSA review that came out earlier this year associated with high-risk money laundering scenarios. And in fact, a lot of institutions are currently using that to actually understand what they need to do in terms of updating those customer due diligence systems or reviewing them to apply the new best practice. A lot of the processes associated with customer due diligence, which is all about knowing your customer, understanding your customer, have overlaps with what needs to be done associated with Fatca. So clever institutions are doing those two things at the same time, or they're future-proofing themselves for Fatca by actually making sure that their customer due diligence systems today have the capabilities to deal with the Fatca problem that they will need to deal with from July 2013. I think that if you do those three things, that will provide the institutions with the best set of starting blocks for them to be able to go out and actually complete the race in terms of their Fatca compliance obligations.